Namaste friends, welcome back to the web technology video learning series. We have covered quite a bit of a ground on HTML and we have started CSS recently. We have covered one lesson on CSS where we just went over what is CSS and how it can be used and so on and so forth, what are its uses and what we should be careful about. In this lesson, we'll be getting a little bit into the CSS. We'll be studying the basic syntax of CSS and so on. So let's review what we have learnt so far. CSS is a style sheet language. It is used for describing the presentation of a document which is written, whose content, to be more precise, is written in a markup language such as HTML. CSS is designed to enable separation of presentation and content, and presentation here includes layout, colors, fonts and lot many more stuff. CSS uses a declarative syntax for defining the styles, and by when we say style, it is a way of presenting. So CSS uses declarative syntax for styles, and the text files that are containing the definitions of these styles are called style sheets. CSS styles can be reused across pages, they can be shared, and in a same file multiple style sheets can be used, right? And we have looked at a real life example of the separation of content and presentation. You can see there is a picture on the right hand side where the same person is shown in different cloths, each giving a different look. This is content and presentation being different. The person is the content, the presentation is the set of styling in terms of cloths that is applied. The CSS, how the content and presentation can be same content can be made to look significantly differently. We have looked at these one website was some web pages where the difference is in stark contrast. So this should give an idea about how powerful CSS can be. I hope you all had a chance to visit their website, CSS Zen Garden, and if you have not already, go there and play with applying different styles and you will understand the power that I am referring to. Let's get back to our topic. This is just the recap. We will see how to use CSS. Before that, let's understand what are the steps involved in making use of CSS. Step number 1, we have to define the style in a style sheet. So this we'll be covering today. The step number 2, we have to refer to the style sheet in a HTML page where we want to use the style. The reference will be made in a HTML header section. Step number 3, now that we have the reference, we start actually using the style in HTML. So step number 1, define the style. Step number 2, refer to the style sheet in HTML page. Step number 3, start using the style. Now these are the general steps. Sometimes depending on how we are referring to the style sheet, there could be a slight difference in how these steps are to be looked at. So that we'll be covering in one of our subsequent classes. But remember, define, refer and use. Okay, let's look at the basic CSS syntax. On the screen, you have some text that says P, open bracket, color, colon, blue, semicolon, text hyphen align, colon, center, semicolon, font hyphen size, colon, 12px, semicolon, followed by a closing bracket. What is this? This, friends, is the style definition. A very simple style definition. Let's look at various aspects of this. The one between the open bracket and the close bracket is the style that we are defining. You can make an educated guess here. We are trying to say that some text we want it to be in the color blue, and we want it to be aligned in the center of the page, and the font size should be 12 pixels only, not more than that, not less than that. So we are defining a style. We will be using this somewhere, where, how, we will see, but this is the definition of a style. You can have your own different styles. For example, you can say, I want, for a particular style, I want the text to be bold, 14 pixels in size, and so on and so forth, left aligned, and have a background picture, all those things. But the definition of a style is what is there on the screen, and whatever definition that we want to put must be between the open bracket and the close bracket. The P which is hanging out on the screen is called a selector. What is a selector? The selector of a style P here identifies which HTML elements the style should be applied to. How does it know? That's a topic of our discussion in the next slide or so. But selector defines or identifies or selects the specific HTML element or elements where the style is to be applied to. The style has properties. I'm sure you are familiar with the HTML tags, and each tag has attributes and values. Likewise, each style also has properties and values. In the example that you have, whatever is there on the left side of the column is a property. For example, color, text align, and font size are the three properties that are used in this style. These are the properties, and each property has a value. Color has a value of blue, text align has a value of center, font size has a value of 12px, standing for 12 pixels. Now, like if you remember, we said learning HTML is nothing but learning all the tags that are supported, possible, how they can be used. If HTML is all about learning tags, CSS is learning all about the properties and values. We cannot have an arbitrary property set there. The property must be defined by the CSS standard and must be supported by the browser. Likewise, we cannot have an arbitrary value for any of the attributes or properties. The values also should be something the standard defines, as long as they are not numbers, and something the browser should support. Okay, these are the values. Recap: a style between the open bracket and the close bracket. Selectors are the ones that are just adjacent to the open bracket. Properties and values are defined as part of the style, and they are separated with a colon. If you remember, in HTML, the attributes and values are delimited by a is equal to sign. In CSS, they are separated by a colon sign. Now, the standard does not actually say that you have to have it neatly defined in multiple lines and with new lines every property and so on. Browsers don't care, or the standards don't care, so we can pretty much combine everything in a single line and then put as shown in the screen. Both the definitions of the styles are identical technically as far as the browser is concerned, as far as the CSS standard is concerned. But if you want your style to be readable, then we should prefer the first format. Now, the subsequent part of the lesson today will focus on the selectors. The picture on the screen shows different classification, the classification of selectors. The selectors are primarily three kinds: element selectors, ID selectors, and class selectors. The element selectors are further classified into simple selectors, universal selectors, and grouping selectors. Remember, selectors are meant to select the HTML elements to apply the style. Let's look at each of these different types. The first one is a simple element selectors. You can see the example on the right hand side on the screen. This is the same example that we have seen earlier few minutes ago for the paragraph or the P, and it says blue color and center aligned text and 12 pixel font size. This is the same example, but here we are referring to P. What is P? P is indicating that it is a paragraph element in a HTML. How do we know? Because this is a simple element selector. What is a simple element selector? Simple element selector uses one of the HTML tag names as its name, nothing less, nothing more. So if the CSS style selector name is the same as a HTML tag name, it is called a HTML simple element selector. Now where does this apply? So we said selector is for identifying or selecting the HTML elements to apply the style. The answer is because we are using the HTML tag name as a selector name, all the tags, all the HTML elements that are using the specified HTML tag are selected for applying the style. For example, if there is a HTML page that has 10 paragraphs and that is using this style, then all 10 paragraphs are rendered identically in blue color, in center aligned text, and in 12 pixel font. Okay, this is how the simple element selector works. The selector selects all HTML elements for applying the style that use the specified HTML tag. This is the simple element selector. There is a slight generalization of this simple element selector. If you use star as the name for the selector, okay, as the example you have on the screen, this means it is applicable for all the elements in all the HTML elements on the page, not just a specific tag, but all HTML elements. That is the selection. It selects all HTML elements because we use star as a selector name. If you use star as a name of the selector, then that is called universal selector. Why is it useful? When is it useful? Imagine you are creating a web page that has a lot of different elements, but you want all of the text to be consistently left aligned, to use the same font, and so on and so forth. Then you just put a universal selector somewhere in the style sheet and then say use black color, center aligned, and maybe font selector font family. You can change this through additional styles later. For example, you can use a universal selector to select a blue color for all the font, and you can have a H1 element selector for H1 headers that can use a red color. So this is the cascading that we discussed in last week. So if there are two selectors that are applicable for a particular HTML tag, both of them will be applied. And in case there is a conflict, the more specific element or style will be applied. So you can say you can have a universal selector that works for most of the text, and then add specific selectors for you as needed. This is a universal selector. Then there is a grouping selector. What is a grouping selector? A grouping selector basically is a simple element selector with more than one tag name separated by commas. Now you should be guessing, and that guess must be quite right now, that this particular selector selects all HTML elements that are any of that use any of the tags that are separated by commas as per the selector name. So if you have a HTML page that has lot of text and some headings, and you are using this particular example as a style, then all the H1 and H2 and H3 will use red color as a font color, and they will be in bold. So this is one way of saying that all your headings should use red and bold. Can you use a universal selector here? You can use a universal selector, but then that means paragraphs will also be in red and bold. You don't want that. You want only the headings. Therefore, use a grouping selector as shown in the example. Okay. So these are the three element selectors: a simple element selector, universal selector, and grouping selectors. These are all characterized by somehow directly referencing a specific HTML tag, therefore becoming applicable to all HTML elements that use those tags. But what if we want something more specific? Okay, CSS has that covered too. Let's look at what is an ID selector. ID selectors use the value of an ID attribute of a HTML element as its name, preceded by a pound sign. Sometimes this is also referred to as a hash sign. Let's remember our HTML a bit. In HTML, each tag can have many attributes. One of the attribute name is called ID, and it can have a value saying ID is equal to so and so inside double quotes. The ID selector uses the value that is specified in the HTML file as the selector name. Okay, let's look at the example. The bottom right hand side shows a paragraph with an ID attribute whose value is quotation. The quotation is a famous one from Sri Vivekananda. But ID, the value of the attribute ID is quotation, and in our style, this same value quotation is used as the name of the selector preceded by a pound sign. So what it means is this particular style is applicable to this particular paragraph. How are we linking? Because the value of the attribute ID is the same as the selector name. That is how the link is made. So this particular quotation, when it is shown on the screen by the browser, will be shown in blue color and in italics font. Now, one thing you should remember, that in a given HTML page, no matter how many number of elements are there, there can only be one HTML element with a given value for the ID attribute, which means you cannot have one more paragraph as shown here with the same value as quotation in the ID. That is not supported or allowed in HTML. What this conversely means is, if we are using an ID selector, there can only be one HTML element ever that can use the corresponding style. If there is a specific element that you want to use the style for, this is the way you should use it. Then there are class selectors. Class selectors also use an attribute from HTML, but instead of using the ID attribute, they use the class attribute of a HTML element. Okay, and instead of using a pound sign as a for naming the selector, the class selectors use a dot symbol, dot sign. You can see the example. The same quotation is written with a dot. Let's look at how the HTML is. In the HTML, you can see there are two quotations, but instead of using the ID attribute, we are using the class attribute. So because this is not an ID attribute, the restriction that you can only have one ID attribute value in the entire web page is no longer here. You can use any number of paragraphs that use the same class. Therefore, the examples here, one from Vivekananda and other from Einstein, both of them are shown with the supplied style. The class selectors apply to all HTML elements which use the selector name as the value for their class attributes. There is no restriction here. Any number of HTML elements can be used with the specific value of the class attribute. Now, these are different simple selectors that we have in CSS. Now, there is no restriction that you have to use one of them. You can actually use a combination of them to get a desired effect. For example, look at the first bullet. It is using a style which is defined as p dot quotation as selector name. This is both a simple element selector which uses p tag as well as a class selector that uses quotation as the value for the class attribute. So, if ever we have a paragraph that obviously is a p tag but that also has quotation for the class attribute, then this particular style is applicable. So you can restrict where this particular style you want it to be applicable by combining the selector. Let's look at the second example. The second example is showing a HTML code which uses both class attribute and the ID attribute. So both the styles from the special selector and the quotation selector are applicable for this paragraph. So this is how you can combine more than one style or more than one selector and then get a desired effect or desired style to your HTML element. This is just a beginning. You should do more research and then find out different ways. This is more artistic than science in my opinion. So whatever way is possible by standard and whatever is supported by browser, it's just the imagination that is the end here to get what kind of effects that we want. So that's it for today's class. We have recapped what is CSS and stuff, and we have looked at the basic CSS syntax in terms of how to define a style, what is a selector, attribute and value, and so on and so forth. Then we took a deep dive into what are different selectors that are possible in CSS, looked at the simple selectors, these element selectors and the universal selectors and the grouping selectors. We also looked at the ID and the class selectors, and we also understood that different combinations of the selectors can be combined to get a desired effect. I would also like to mention the cascading part of it. If there is a HTML element that can have multiple styles because of the way that the styles are defined, browser combines all the styles and then applies them. For example, you may have a universal selector that says text is equal to black, color is black, and you have a H1 selector that says font size is 14. Then the heading or the H1 element has both styles applied. So it is both black in color and 14 font size, 14 pixels in font size. So this is cascading. But you should also remember that we should not have any conflict while defining the styles this way. If you have and if there is a conflict, then the browser will make a call on what is the right style to apply. Consider the example of a universal selector that says font size is 12, but a H1 selector that says font size is 14. So when the browser has to render a H1 element, it obviously sees that there are two styles that are applicable, but there is a conflict because both of them are trying to set the font size. The browser will make a choice to use H1 element selector and picks up 14 as a font size. So ideally we should avoid this, but sometimes this is used to minimize the amount of CSS that needs to be written, because browser will always make the right call, right? Okay, so that's about it for the class today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have not had a chance to go through the first video on in this series, I suggest you go back and then have a relook at it. We'll meet each other again in our next class. Until then, bye bye.